So, Peter Greste, the AFP raids on the ABC are deemed by the Federal Court to be valid. What does that actually mean?
Well, what the court effectively said was that the police were acting in accordance with the letter of the law. The ABC was trying to say, well, the letter of the law violates the higher principle, the constitutional principle of an implied right of political communication. The court said, well, sorry, but the police are dealing with a very concrete, specific law, and that trumps your appeal to a higher but implied right.
So it's legally the AFP was right, and the ABC was arguing that press freedom, that there's a higher right, if you like,
there's
and
a
that
higher
is
principle, yes.
the press freedom, and that is why the Alliance for Journalist Freedom has been calling for a Media Freedom Act, because that would ensure that the courts had to take into consideration press freedom issues.
Yeah, that's right. One of the problems with, particularly around the debate over law reform, is that even if we try to amend the law to take press freedom into account, you're never going to be able to deal with every single loophole that exists throughout the entire legal code. That is just a massively and frankly an impossibly complex task. The police, in fact, used a law criminalising the receipt of stolen property in the case of the raids on the ABC. They considered information to be property, and therefore by accepting that information, the ABC was receiving stolen goods. That's not a kind of law that you can see our legislators inserting a provision for press freedom. What a Media Freedom Act would do then is establish the principle in law. It would compel the judges to say, okay, whenever you're dealing with a case that has the potential to limit press freedom, you have to take its implications for press freedom into account. It doesn't mean that it trumps everything, it just means that it has to be considered.
Right. Now, the other aspect to this is that it seems to us that in both instances, in the ABC instance, the story they were working on, the Afghan Files, and the Annika Smethurst instance, neither were were high priorities for national security. So in a way, this whole argument about the need to clamp down on journalism because they breach security is a bit hollow.
Yeah, and let's have, again, a good close look at what happened in these cases. The way the law is designed is to stop the leak of national security information in a way that would genuinely compromise and endanger our national security, that put lives at risk. And that's absolutely understandable, completely acceptable. But what's happened is that these two stories were dealing with the security agencies, but not dealing with national security issues. There was nothing in any of the stories that either of these two news organisations published that in any way threatened or undermined national security. What they were exposing, though, were stories that were genuinely in the public interest, that you and I, and as voters and everybody in Australia, needs to be aware of. And so where you're in a situation where the law criminalises that kind of public interest reporting that doesn't undermine national security, then we've got a problem with the law that needs fixing.
So, and we can come back to we the voters in a sec, but before we do, that brings into play David McBride, who was the whistleblower, who is almost inevitably going to be up, because even if the federal police and the security forces don't think they're particularly important cases, they've now got a process of self-justification, if you like, where they're going to have to ping this poor bloke for being the whistleblower. Which brings in a whole other issue about protection of whistleblowers.
Yeah, and this protection is already established in law. There are shield laws that are designed to give journalists the right to decline to give over their sources in a trial, in a court. Now, those shield laws are meaningless if the police have other ways of going to find and track down those whistleblowers. And this is
which is what the raids were all about,
which is precisely what the raids were intended to do. The raids were designed to find evidence of the sources of those stories.
Yeah.
And this is also really key, because if we shut down access to those sources, if we make it impossible for journalists to access and protect those sources, then the whole journalistic principle of gaining access to information that is embarrassing to the government starts to collapse. Whistleblowers won't come forward to journalists. Journalists will be too afraid to publish. and therefore we will see an overall loss of transparency and accountability in government, which will be hugely damaging.
And precisely, and it's damaging not because we want to protect whistleblowers and boost journalists' pay salary packets as a principle. It's actually about ensuring that the public has information so that the public can be informed sufficiently to vote, so that ultimately they get good government.
Yeah, exactly. And the problem is the government, the Prime Minister, the Home Affairs Minister, the Attorney General have all said that journalists shouldn't be considered as above the law. And they're absolutely right when they say that. But we're not trying to protect journalists as some special class of people. What we're trying to protect is the function that journalism plays in our democracy. And that function is to act as a whistle of last resort, as a way of maintaining accountability and transparency in our governments on behalf of the voters. That's what's at stake here, and it's a really crucial distinction because it's fundamental to the way our democracy works.
And you can see recently through the bushfires and then more recently through the coronavirus how absolutely important good journalism has been in forcing accountability of politicians, both in Australia and around the world in the case of the coronavirus.
And anybody who's watched the news over the last few months will recognise that governments are just as capable of behaving inappropriately as anybody else. That's not to suggest that the whole system is corrupt or that every politician is misbehaving, but it is a part of the system that we need to protect.
It's a healthy democracy. More so in Australia, I think, because of compulsory voting. If we're going to be punished for not voting, then at least give us access to the bloody information so that we can actually vote as well-informed people. Thank you very much, Peter.
It's a pleasure.